It was a cool evening in the sleepy town of Vicksburg, Mississippi, when the fire started. The house, nestled at the edge of the town near the riverbank, was one of the oldest in the neighborhood. The wooden structure creaked under the weight of its age as flames shot up, consuming everything in their path. The fire was fierce, the crackling of the timber loud enough to be heard from blocks away. Neighbors stood at a distance, helpless and shocked. There was nothing anyone could do. The fire department arrived too late to save anyone. Inside, a woman was trapped. Deborah Turner, the wife of Pastor James Turner, lay in the burning inferno. Her body, burned beyond recognition, was discovered later by the firefighters. The community was in shock. Deborah was well liked, and the Turners had been known as a couple that symbolized the goodness and peace of the small Mississippi town. But no one expected the truth behind her death. Not at first. The authorities quickly ruled the fire an accident. They believed the flames started from a faulty heater in the house, a tragic incident that claimed the life of the pastor's wife. The town was sympathetic, and Pastor Turner was praised for his strength and faith in the wake of such a terrible loss. People brought casseroles, flowers, and condolences, offering their support to the grieving husband. However, something about the case didn't sit right with Detective Sam Harris. Harris had been investigating crimes in Vicksburg for over 20 years. He knew the small-town life like the back of his hand, and he had seen his share of murders disguised as accidents. The grief seemed too staged. The silence from the pastor, the lack of any real emotion in his eyes. Harris knew something was off. Pastor Turner had been the first one to arrive at the scene. His clothes, neat and without a hint of soot, suggested he hadn't been inside the house during the fire. Harris noted how the pastor's face seemed almost too calm, as if he had already accepted the tragic event as his fate. Harris didn't believe in coincidences, and he was sure there was more to Deborah's death than met the eye. It wasn't just the fire, it was the way it all happened. The perfect timing of it, the lack of signs that anything was amiss before the blaze. As the town moved on, Harris found himself growing more suspicious by the day. A small, unmarked envelope arrived at Harris's office a week later. Inside was a single piece of paper with the words, "Check his alibi." The handwriting was neat, but the message was chilling. Who had sent the note? Harris didn't know, but he was certain of one thing. The investigation was just beginning. Detective Sam Harris sat in his office, staring at the small, unmarked envelope. The handwriting on the note was neat, precise, almost too perfect. The words were simple, "Check his alibi." But for some reason, the note struck a nerve with Harris. It was the kind of cryptic message that hinted at something deeper, something hidden just beneath the surface. The fire that took Deborah Turner's life had been ruled an accident, but Harris wasn't convinced. Everything about the case felt off, from the pastor's calm demeanor to the odd circumstances surrounding the fire. He decided to follow the lead. The note mentioned the alibi. What could it possibly mean? Was it suggesting that Pastor Turner had something to hide? Harris knew he had to tread carefully. Pastor James Turner was a man of faith, a pillar of the community. He had built a reputation as a God-fearing preacher who was deeply loved by the people of Vicksburg. No one wanted to believe that a man like him could be capable of anything sinister. But Harris had seen too many cases like this before. Beneath the surface of every small town, secrets festered, and sometimes the most upstanding citizens hid the darkest of truths. He made a phone call to the Vicksburg Police Department, requesting access to Pastor Turner's statements and any reports from the fire department. He needed to know every detail, every scrap of information that could help him piece together what really happened that night. The fire had been intense. The flames had destroyed nearly everything in the house, including most of the evidence that might have been useful in determining the cause. But there were still a few things that hadn't been consumed by the fire, things that might provide a clue. Harris asked the fire department to send over their report. While waiting for the information to arrive, Harris made a decision. He would visit Pastor Turner. He needed to see him in person, to observe him, to see if there was any trace of guilt in his behavior. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe it was all just an unfortunate accident. But something told him that the pastor wasn't being entirely truthful. The next day, Harris drove to the Turner household, a modest but well-kept home on the outskirts of town. The house looked like any other in Vicksburg, quiet, serene, and surrounded by the natural beauty of the Mississippi River. As Harris approached, he noticed a few people lingering outside the house, bringing food and offering condolences. It was clear that the town still supported Pastor Turner, but there was a tense atmosphere hanging in the air. The kind of tension you feel when everyone is pretending everything is okay, even when it's not. Harris parked his car and walked up to the front door. He rang the bell, and after a few moments the door opened. Pastor Turner stood in the doorway, his face calm, his eyes dark with a quiet sadness. He was dressed in a black suit, the same one he had worn for the funeral. His demeanor was respectful, but there was something distant about him. It was as if he was going through the motions of grief without truly feeling it. "Detective Harris," Turner said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I was expecting you." Harris nodded, giving the pastor a firm handshake. "Pastor Turner, I'm sorry for your loss. I know it's a difficult time, but I just need to ask you a few questions about the night of the fire." Turner's expression didn't change, but there was a slight tightening around his eyes. "Of course. Anything I can do to help." Harris followed him inside the house, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. It felt strange to be here, knowing what had happened in this very home just days before. The place was spotless, almost too spotless, as if everything had been cleaned and polished to perfection. Harris couldn't help but wonder if this was the home of a grieving widower or a man with something to hide. They sat in the living room, the air thick with the kind of uncomfortable silence that comes from asking questions no one wants to answer. "I just need to understand what happened that night," Harris began, his voice steady. "You said you were at the church when the fire broke out?" Pastor Turner nodded, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "Yes, that's right. I was finishing up some paperwork at the church. Deborah had stayed home to rest. She had been feeling a little under the weather the last few days. I spoke with her on the phone around 9:30 p.m. before heading to bed. Everything seemed fine." "Were you sure she was alone in the house?" Harris asked, his gaze never leaving Turner's face. Turner hesitated for just a moment, his eyes flicking to the side before returning to meet Harris's gaze. "Yes, I'm sure. Deborah wouldn't have let anyone in without me knowing. She was a very private person." Harris noted the slight shift in Turner's tone. There was no hesitation when he spoke about being at the church, but when it came to Deborah being alone, there was a subtle change in his demeanor. It was almost as if he was trying to convince himself of something. "You don't find it strange that there were no signs of a break-in?" Harris asked, leaning forward. "No signs of forced entry? No evidence that Deborah tried to escape?" Turner's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "The fire was so intense, Detective. It's possible that the smoke inhalation could have incapacitated her before she could get out." Harris frowned. "Possible, but you've been told that the fire department couldn't find any signs of malfunction with the heater, right? The blaze was too specific, too contained. It doesn't seem like an accident." Pastor Turner's eyes tightened further, but he said nothing. He simply stared at Harris, his hands now clasped tightly together. "I know this is hard," Harris continued, his voice calm, "but you have to understand, I'm just doing my job. If you know anything that could help, now would be the time to tell me." Pastor Turner's jaw clenched. For a moment there was silence between them, and Harris felt the weight of the pastor's unspoken words hanging in the air. "I've already told you everything I know," Turner said finally, his voice low and controlled. "If you think I'm hiding something, Detective, you're mistaken." Harris stood up, offering Turner a polite nod. "Thank you for your time, Pastor. I'll be in touch." As Harris left the house, he felt a growing sense of unease. The pastor's calm, controlled responses didn't sit right with him. Something about Turner's behavior felt rehearsed, too practiced. Harris knew there was more to the story, and he wasn't going to let this case slip away. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't help but wonder, was Pastor Turner hiding something? Or was he simply a man trying to survive in a world that had just shattered around him? The answers, Harris knew, were buried somewhere in the ashes of the fire, and he would uncover them, no matter what it took. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. The investigation was beginning to take on a life of its own. Detective Sam Harris could feel it. The deeper he dug, the more the mystery of Deborah Turner's death began to unravel. His gut told him something was wrong, but every lead he chased only seemed to raise more questions than answers. The community's overwhelming support for Pastor James Turner, though seemingly genuine, had begun to feel more like a wall. People weren't talking, and the more they shut their mouths, the more suspicious the entire town became. Harris had made several attempts to gather more information from people close to the Turners, but every door seemed to close before he could get the answers he needed. Pastor Turner's behavior at the scene of the fire had been strange, to say the least. He had been the first to arrive, yet there had been no visible signs of distress on his face. That alone had thrown up a red flag for Harris, but he had no hard evidence. At least not yet. The fire department's report had provided little help. Their investigation had concluded that the fire had started in the living room, likely due to a faulty space heater, but there was no concrete proof, no clear sign of arson, no indication of foul play. The fire had been intense but oddly contained, with most of the damage focused around the center of the house. The walls and furniture in the back rooms remained mostly intact. It didn't add up. What made it even more puzzling was the lack of any evidence of Deborah trying to escape. There had been no signs of her attempting to flee the house, no broken windows, no signs of struggle. Deborah had been a woman who, according to those who knew her, was fiercely independent and strong-willed. The idea that she would simply die in a fire without putting up a fight didn't sit right with Harris. It wasn't long before he began to question the people around the Turners. Harris started with Deborah's closest friend, Lily Caldwell, a woman who had known her for years. Lily was the one person who seemed willing to speak openly about Deborah, even if it meant digging up painful memories. Lily's house was tucked away in a quiet part of town. It was a modest place, with an old porch swing that creaked when you sat on it. Harris knocked on the door, his mind focused on the questions he needed to ask. He had learned from experience that people who were closest to the victims often had the answers he needed, even if they didn't realize it. Lily answered the door with a tired smile, her eyes red as if she hadn't been sleeping well. The news of Deborah's death had shaken her more than she let on. Harris could tell right away that she wasn't just grieving a friend. There was something else there, something she wasn't saying. "Detective Harris," Lily said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you. Is this about Deborah?" "Yes, ma'am," Harris replied, sitting down on the couch. "I just need to ask you a few questions about her and her relationship with Pastor Turner." Lily nodded and sat down across from him. "I'll answer whatever I can. It's been so hard, you know. I don't even know how to process this. Deborah was so full of life. She didn't deserve this." Harris studied her face closely. Her grief was real. There was no doubt about that. But he could tell there was more to the story. She knew something. He could feel it in his gut. "Did Deborah ever talk about her marriage?" Harris asked gently. "Was she happy with Pastor Turner?" Lily hesitated, glancing out the window before answering. "They were happy, at least, that's what I thought. But Pastor Turner was different at home. He was always very controlling, I guess you could say. Deborah was a strong woman, but sometimes I think she just wanted to make things work for him. He had this way of making everything seem like it was for God's will. It's hard to explain. She didn't really talk about it much, but I could see it in her eyes. Sometimes she looked trapped." Harris leaned forward, sensing he was getting closer to something important. "Trapped? In what way?" Lily bit her lip, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. She would always say that James was a good man, but he didn't take kindly to criticism. And if she ever did question him or challenge him, he'd become distant. He'd shut down. I remember a few times she came to me upset, saying that she didn't feel like he cared anymore. But then the next day, he'd be all loving and sweet, and she'd forgive him. She loved him, and I think in some ways she was afraid of him. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. "Afraid of him?" Lily nodded. "Yeah, I don't know the full story, but there were times when she seemed, I don't know, scared. It's like there was something he was holding over her head. I don't know what it was, but I could tell she was scared. And I think the rest of the town didn't see it because, they adored James. He's the pastor. He's above reproach." Harris took note of Lily's words. There it was again. This sense that Pastor Turner wasn't as perfect as everyone thought. But what was he hiding? What kind of power did he have over Deborah? The question gnawed at Harris. He pressed further. "Did Deborah ever mention any other man? Anyone who could have been a potential threat? Lily hesitated. There was someone a while ago. Deborah confided in me once about a man she'd met, someone at church who was very friendly with her. I never got the full story, but I remember her saying that this man seemed to be the only person who really saw her for who she was, not just as the pastor's wife, but she didn't seem to want to pursue it, and I think she kept it from James. Maybe out of fear, I don't know. Harris's mind was racing. Could this other man have been involved in some way? Had Deborah been having an affair? And if so, was that the reason for her death? The questions kept piling up, each one more unsettling than the last. Harris left Lily's house with more questions than answers. Her words had confirmed what he had already suspected. Deborah had been unhappy, possibly afraid, and maybe even hiding something. But what was it? Was it a man? Or was it something darker? Something tied to her marriage with James Turner? As Harris drove back to the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. He had to dig deeper into Pastor Turner's past. There had to be a reason why Deborah had felt trapped, why she had felt scared of the man she had once loved. The investigation was far from over, but Harris knew one thing for certain. Pastor James Turner was hiding something, and he would find out what it was, no matter how many secrets the good pastor tried to keep buried. Detective Sam Harris sat at his desk, the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. He stared at the files spread out before him, crime scene photos, witness statements, Pastor James Turner's alibi, and the notes from his recent conversation with Lily Caldwell. The more he learned, the more complicated the case became. The pastor's image as a devout, God-fearing man was starting to crack, and the deeper Harris dug, the more he realized that the truth was buried in layers of deception. Lily had been the first person to suggest that Pastor Turner was controlling and that Deborah had been afraid of him. Harris couldn't ignore that. A person who was afraid didn't simply die in a fire without attempting to escape. He was convinced now that this wasn't an accident, and Deborah's death had to be more than just a simple tragedy. But what was the true story? Harris knew he needed more information on James Turner, something deeper than the image of the pious pastor everyone knew. He needed to understand who this man truly was, and what kind of person would burn his wife alive. The next step in Harris's investigation was clear. He needed to go back into Pastor Turner's past. Every person had a history, and Harris believed that uncovering Turner's would shed light on his present actions. There was something about the pastor that Harris couldn't shake, a sense that he was hiding more than just an affair or marital conflict. There was darkness in him, and it had to be revealed. Harris paid a visit to the local courthouse, hoping to find something useful in the public records. After a few hours of combing through old case files, he found what he was looking for: an old arrest record from when James Turner was just starting out as a young man in Vicksburg. The record wasn't particularly long, but it was enough to raise an eyebrow. In his 20s, Turner had been arrested for assault, an incident that had been dismissed when the victim failed to show up for court. The details were sparse, but it was clear that Turner had been involved in a violent altercation. Harris wasn't sure if this incident was relevant, but the connection between Turner's past and his present behavior needed to be explored. He dug deeper into the court records, hoping to find more. In the public domain, there were no further criminal charges against Turner. But something about this arrest kept nagging at Harris. He knew he needed to speak with people who had known Turner long before he became the revered pastor of Vicksburg. Later that evening, Harris found himself sitting across from an older man at a small diner in the center of town. The man, Henry Hank Walker, had known James Turner since they were boys. Walker was a retired mechanic, now in his late 60s, with a quiet demeanor and a sharp memory. "Hank, thanks for meeting with me," Harris said as he slid into the booth. "I've been looking into James Turner's past. I know you've known him a long time. I'm trying to figure out who he really is. Can you help me with that?" Hank took a slow sip of coffee and looked out the window for a moment before answering. "James? Yeah, I've known him since we were kids. He was always a quiet one. Seemed like he had a good heart, but he was different from the others. I remember when he started preaching, the way he spoke about God. It was like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Harris leaned forward, sensing there was more. What do you mean by that? Trying to convince himself? Hank shrugged. Well, back in the day, James got into a lot of trouble. I don't think he was as perfect as everyone thought. He had a temper, especially when he was younger. The way he handled people who crossed him, it wasn't pretty. There was a time when he almost beat a guy senseless, over something small too. I remember because I had to step in and stop it. James had this look in his eyes like he was ready to kill him. Harris's pulse quickened. This was the confirmation he needed. Pastor Turner's temper wasn't just a rumor, it was real and it had been dangerous. The same man who preached love and forgiveness had a violent past, and the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. Did you ever hear about anything happening with Deborah? Harris asked, his voice low. Any problems in their marriage? Hank was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if weighing the question. Finally he spoke. I never heard anything, not at first. But after James became a preacher, he changed. He became more controlling, I guess. I didn't see it firsthand, but I heard people talk. People said that Deborah started to pull away from him, but I don't know if it was true. She was always so calm, never really said much about him, but I know she didn't look too happy, and especially in the last few years. Do you think he ever hurt her? Harris asked bluntly. Hank's face hardened. I don't know, but James wasn't a man to be crossed. I saw him once get into a shouting match with one of the deacons. I thought they were going to throw down right there in the church. So yeah, maybe. But you're asking the wrong guy. I don't know what went on behind closed doors. Harris nodded, knowing that Hank's suspicions were worth exploring. He wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but the pattern was becoming clearer. Pastor Turner had a history of violent tendencies, and it seemed to be escalating over the years. The more Harris learned about him, the more convinced he became that Turner was capable of something far darker than anyone in the community could imagine. That night, Harris couldn't sleep. He kept going over everything he had learned, all the conflicting pieces of the puzzle. Pastor Turner's temper, his violent past, the strained relationship with his wife, the mysterious phone calls Deborah had made before her death. It all pointed to one thing. James Turner had killed his wife. The fire wasn't an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated murder. But there was one more question that lingered in Harris's mind. Who had helped him? Harris recalled the strange cryptic note he had received. Check his alibi. Someone knew the truth. Someone wanted to expose it. But why? He realized that in order to solve this case, he had to uncover every single detail. He couldn't leave any stone unturned. Pastor Turner might have thought he had gotten away with it, but Harris was certain he had made a mistake somewhere. No one could outrun the truth forever, and Harris was closing in. The morning after his meeting with Hank Walker, Detective Sam Harris found himself walking the streets of Vicksburg with a growing sense of urgency. He had reached a point in the investigation where the facts were undeniable. Pastor James Turner was no longer just a man grieving the loss of his wife. He was a man with a violent past, a man who had likely murdered Deborah Turner, and now Harris had to prove it. But something still gnawed at him. The strange note. Check his alibi. Someone was out there who knew more than they were letting on. Harris wasn't sure whether it was someone within the church, someone who had witnessed the tension between Deborah and James, or perhaps an outsider who had seen something they shouldn't have. Whoever it was, they were trying to steer him toward the truth. As Harris continued to piece together the puzzle, he realized that the more he learned about the Turners, the more he uncovered about the web of deceit that had surrounded them. The pastor's carefully constructed image as a pillar of the community had begun to crack, revealing a man who was not only capable of violence, but also willing to manipulate everyone around him to protect his secrets. Harris returned to the sheriff's office and pulled the most recent statements from the fire department and the coroner's report. There was something that had been bothering him about the official cause of death. Deborah Turner had died from burns, yes, but the coroner's report also mentioned signs of severe trauma to her body before the fire had started. The medical examiner had noted that her ribs were fractured and her left wrist appeared to have been broken, likely from a blow. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't the result of a simple domestic dispute. It was indicative of something far more brutal. The signs of trauma, combined with the fact that Deborah had been trapped in a fire that had burned most of the house to the ground, suggested that someone had incapacitated her before setting the blaze. Pastor Turner had arrived on the scene too quickly, and his calm demeanor only added to the suspicion. Was it possible that he had staged the scene, making sure that the fire would destroy any evidence of the true cause of death? Harris could feel the walls closing in on Turner. He needed a confession, or at the very least, hard evidence that tied him to the crime. That afternoon, Harris visited the church where Pastor Turner had been the spiritual leader for over a decade. The building stood at the heart of Vicksburg, a beautiful old structure with tall windows and white columns, a symbol of the town's deeply rooted faith. It had been here that Turner had built his reputation as a man of God, and it was here that he had gained the trust of everyone in town. But as Harris stood in the shadow of the church, he began to realize just how much of Turner's power lay in his ability to control his image. The community trusted him blindly. They believed in his sanctity, his purity, and his divine purpose. What they didn't know was that Turner's life was built on a foundation of lies. Inside, the church was eerily quiet. The pews were empty, save for a few parishioners who sat near the front, praying silently. The stained glass windows filtered sunlight onto the cool, polished floor. Harris walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He had to find something, anything, that could tie Turner to the murder of his wife. He was greeted by one of the church's deacons, a man named Michael Greer, who had been with the church for as long as Harris could remember. Greer was a devout man, respected in the community, but something about him felt off to Harris. Maybe it was the way his eyes flickered nervously when they made contact. "Detective Harris," Greer said, his voice smooth but wary. "What brings you to the church today?" "I'm still investigating the fire that took Deborah's life," Harris said, watching Greer closely. "I need to ask you about Pastor Turner. I need to know if you noticed anything unusual before the fire. Anything that might explain what happened." Greer stiffened, his hands clasping behind his back. "Pastor Turner is a good man, a man of God. He's been through a lot lately with Deborah's passing. I understand that, but this isn't just about grief," Harris replied. "Something isn't adding up, Mr. Greer. I'm trying to understand what led to the fire. Did you notice any tension between the pastor and Deborah? Anything that stood out?" Greer shifted uncomfortably. Harris saw the way his lips pressed together, the hesitation in his eyes. He was hiding something. I don't think I'm the right person to ask about that," Greer said quietly. "The pastor's marriage was private. I don't want to speak ill of him or his family," Harris pressed further. "But it's important. It's the only way I can get to the truth. I need to know what happened, Mr. Greer. If you saw anything, heard anything, please, I need you to tell me." There was a long silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Greer sighed. "There was something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A few months ago, Pastor Turner had a confrontation with Deborah. I don't know the details, but I heard them shouting in the office. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard her say something about leaving him. She said that she couldn't take it anymore, that she was going to leave him if things didn't change. And Pastor Turner, well, he didn't take that too kindly. I didn't hear what he said back, but I could tell it was bad." Harris's mind raced. This was the first piece of real evidence that he had found to suggest there was more going on in that house than anyone realized. If Deborah had threatened to leave, then maybe the fire was an act of desperation, an attempt to control her, to keep her from escaping. Harris had a feeling that the confrontation in the office had been more than just a disagreement. It had been the spark that led to Deborah's death. "You're sure about this?" Harris asked, his voice urgent. Greer nodded reluctantly. "Yes, I didn't want to get involved, but I couldn't ignore it. After that day, things seemed to change. Deborah was distant, and the pastor, well, he wasn't the same after that. There was a coldness in his eyes. Harris had what he needed: the confrontation, the broken relationship, and the pastor's cold response. All of it fit together. The more Harris learned about Pastor Turner's temper, the more it became clear that the fire had not been a tragic accident. It had been a deliberate act of control. As Harris left the church, he felt a deep sense of urgency. He was closing in on Pastor Turner, but there was one more thing he needed to confirm. He had to know where Turner had been the night of the fire. Turner's alibi was shaky at best, and Harris suspected that it had been fabricated to cover up his tracks. The time was coming for him to confront Turner directly. But for now, Harris had a clearer picture. Turner had killed his wife, not out of a moment of madness, but out of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being exposed. And Harris was certain of one thing: Pastor James Turner would not get away with this. Detective Sam Harris woke early the next morning with one thought on his mind. He had to confront Pastor James Turner. The evidence was stacking up against him. Deborah Turner's death had all the hallmarks of a cold, calculated murder, one fueled by fear, control, and desperation. Harris was no longer looking for answers. He had them. What he needed now was the truth, and the only person who could give it to him was Turner. Harris had spent the previous day speaking to witnesses, piecing together the fragments of Pastor Turner's life. Every lead he followed seemed to reveal a man consumed by control, a man who would stop at nothing to keep his grip on those around him. The more he learned, the more the pattern of abuse and manipulation emerged. The confrontation between Deborah and Turner, the broken marriage, the strained atmosphere in the church, it was all starting to fit together. Now all that remained was the final step: getting Pastor Turner to admit his guilt. It was still early when Harris drove to the Turner's house, the sun just beginning to rise over the sleepy town of Vicksburg. The house, once a symbol of the perfect Christian family, now stood as a cold, eerie monument to the lies and tragedy that had unfolded inside its walls. Pastor Turner was home, as expected. The man had not left town since Deborah's death, and he had remained conspicuously calm through it all. When Harris arrived at the front door, he could see through the window that Turner was pacing back and forth in the living room, his hands clasped behind his back. He seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. Harris wasn't sure if it was a sense of guilt or arrogance, but there was something in Turner's posture that suggested he knew this day would come. He had been waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Harris knocked firmly on the door, his heartbeat quickening. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing Pastor Turner in a freshly pressed suit, his face a picture of forced calm. "Detective Harris," Turner said, his voice smooth and controlled. "What can I do for you this morning?" "I'm here to talk about your wife's death, Pastor," Harris replied, his voice firm. "We need to discuss what really happened that night." Pastor Turner's expression didn't change. If anything, it became colder. "You've already investigated, haven't you? You know what happened. It was a tragic accident. I've told you all I know." Harris stepped inside, the air inside the house still and heavy. The place had been untouched since the fire, as if Turner hadn't been able to bring himself to clean up the mess left behind. There was a stillness in the air, an unnatural calm. "I've reviewed the case, Pastor," Harris said, his eyes scanning the room. "And I've spoken to a lot of people. People who know you, people who know your wife. Deborah didn't die in an accident. She was murdered." Turner's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained calm. "That's absurd. My wife was a good woman, a devoted wife. She loved me and I loved her. This town loved her. Then why was she afraid of you?" Harris asked, his voice cutting through the tension. "Why did she say she was going to leave you? Why did she say you'd lose control if she did?" The question hit Turner like a physical blow. His expression faltered for a moment, the facade cracking just enough for Harris to see the flicker of anger in his eyes. It was fleeting, but Harris didn't miss it. "People say things when they are upset," Turner replied, his voice lower now, almost defensive. "Deborah and I had our disagreements, but I never meant her harm." "Your wife was terrified of you, Pastor," Harris pressed, "and she didn't die by accident. You killed her." For the first time since Harris had arrived, Turner's mask began to slip. His eyes flashed with something darker now, something menacing. He stepped closer to Harris, his voice growing colder, more forceful. "Watch your tone, detective," Turner said. "You don't know what you're talking about. I didn't kill my wife. I loved her." "Then why did you do it?" Harris asked, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Why did you beat her and then burn her alive?" Turner froze. For a moment it seemed as if he was struggling to maintain his composure. Harris could see the internal battle raging in his mind. He was trying to keep the facade up, trying to keep control, but the dam had been cracked, and Harris could see the truth trying to force its way out. "You don't understand," Turner muttered almost to himself. "She was going to leave me. She was going to ruin everything I worked for. My ministry, my reputation. I couldn't let her do that." Harris took a step closer, his eyes locked on Turner's. "So, you killed her to keep control?" Turner's breath hitched, and for the briefest moment, Harris saw the desperation in his eyes. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, Turner's expression hardened again. He looked at Harris with a coldness that sent a chill down the detective's spine. "I didn't want to," Turner said, his voice almost a whisper now. "But I had no choice. She was going to destroy everything I built. She wanted to leave, to expose me for who I really was. Do you understand what that would have done to me? To my reputation? To everything I had done for this town?" Harris's heart raced. This was it. The confession. "You're saying you killed your wife to protect yourself, to protect your image?" Turner nodded, his face a mask of indifference now. "She was weak. She didn't understand the bigger picture. I had to make sure she couldn't take everything from me. I didn't want to do it, but I had no choice." Harris shook his head, disgusted. "You didn't have to do it, Pastor. You chose to." Turner's eyes narrowed. "I did what I had to do, and now you've come here to ruin my life. You think I'm the bad guy, but I did what anyone would do. I had to protect what was mine." "You killed her," Harris said, his voice hard. "You beat her, broke her bones, and then you burned her alive. You murdered her, and now you'll pay for it." For a moment there was silence in the room, broken only by the faint sound of the ticking clock on the wall. Then Pastor Turner finally broke down, his composure shattered. He sank into a nearby chair, his face pale and hollow. "I never wanted to hurt her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't let her leave me. I couldn't." Harris stood over him, his heart heavy with the weight of the confession. He had what he needed. Pastor James Turner had admitted to killing his wife, and now the truth was out. "You'll pay for what you've done," Harris said quietly. "You'll never be able to hide from this." As Harris turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of finality in the air. The case was far from over, but it was clear now. Pastor James Turner, the man who had once been seen as a pillar of the community, had been hiding a dark secret, and now justice would finally be served. The courthouse loomed over Vicksburg like an old weathered sentinel, its columns and facades steeped in the history of the town. As Detective Sam Harris walked through its grand entrance, he couldn't help but reflect on how things had changed in the past few weeks. The case of Deborah Turner's death had been a shocking one. Pastor James Turner, once seen as a pillar of the community, was now the man behind the most horrific crime the town had witnessed in years. The truth had come out, and no amount of faith or devotion could hide what Turner had done. Harris had witnessed the confession with his own eyes, but as he stood in the courthouse lobby, his thoughts drifted back to the past few days. The case had been much more than just a murder investigation. It had unearthed the ugly truth about a man who had built his entire life on lies and manipulation. Turner had been a master of control, not just over his wife, but over the entire town. And now, as the trial approached, it was Harris's responsibility to make sure that the justice Deborah Turner so tragically deserved would be served. The trial had been scheduled for the following week. Turner had been charged with first-degree murder, and his defense team was already gearing up to try to paint him as a man who had been pushed too far, a victim of his circumstances. But Harris knew better. Turner wasn't the victim. Deborah Turner had been. Harris had done his job, meticulously piecing together the facts, and now it was up to the courtroom to decide his fate. As Harris walked toward the prosecutor's office, he was greeted by Claire Mitchell, the assistant district attorney. She was sharp, intelligent, and driven, qualities that had made her one of the most formidable lawyers in the district. She had taken the case personally, and it was clear she wasn't going to let Turner walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. "Detective Harris," Claire said, offering him a brief nod of acknowledgement. "We're almost ready. I just got off the phone with the judge. The trial will start on Monday. Everything's in place?" Harris asked, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of uncertainty. He knew that even the most well-prepared case could falter if something went wrong at the last minute. Yes, we've got all the evidence. We've got his confession. We've got the forensic reports, the testimonies, and the statements from people in the church. James Turner is going to have a hard time explaining his way out of this one, she said with a determined smile. But I know you've got your doubts. You're wondering if it's enough, aren't you? Harris sighed. He wasn't sure how much of his unease was coming from the case itself or the weight of the responsibility he felt for Deborah Turner's death. He had seen too many criminals try to escape justice, too many innocent victims left to suffer in the wake of lies and deceit. Pastor Turner, however, wasn't going to get away with it. Not this time. It's not the case itself, Harris said slowly. It's more about what he's done to this town. Turner manipulated so many people, convinced them he was a man of God. He's taken everything from Deborah, and now he's taken her life. It's not just about finding justice for her anymore. It's about showing everyone who he really was. Claire nodded in understanding. I know. It's about more than just the law. It's about the truth coming to light and making sure that everyone knows what he really did. People trusted him. They looked up to him, and now they need to see him for who he really is. That Monday, the courtroom was packed. News of Pastor Turner's arrest had spread like wildfire through the town, and people were eager to see justice done. The benches were filled with people who had once prayed beside him, attended his sermons, and believed in his righteous mission. Many of them still wore the solemn expressions of grief, unable to reconcile the man they had trusted with the horrific truth that had emerged. Turner's trial had divided the town. Some still clung to the image of the kind, caring pastor, while others now saw him as a cold-blooded killer. Harris sat in the back watching the proceedings with a sense of finality. He had already done his part. It was now in the hands of the jury, who would determine whether Pastor Turner would be held accountable for the death of his wife. As the trial began, the prosecutor, Claire Mitchell, stood up to present the case. She was poised, confident, and fierce, with a clarity that filled the room. Her first move was to present the evidence, the crime scene photos, the coroner's report, and the forensic analysis of the fire that had taken Deborah's life. Each piece of evidence painted a grim picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare that had ended in her brutal murder. Then came the confession. Claire Mitchell played the recording of Pastor Turner's confession to the police, his cold and calculated admission of guilt echoing through the courtroom. Turner had admitted that he killed his wife to protect his reputation, to control her, and to stop her from leaving him. He had beaten her, broken her wrist, and then set the house on fire, ensuring that any evidence of the murder would be destroyed in the flames. Harris watched as the jury listened intently to the confession, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. They had heard it all, the words of a man who had once been a leader in their community, a man who had shown no remorse for his actions. And now there was no turning back. As the defense took their turn, they tried to portray Pastor Turner as a man driven to madness by the pressures of his life, his ministry, and the unraveling of his marriage. They argued that Deborah's death was a tragic accident, that Turner had acted in a moment of rage, and that his actions were not premeditated. But the evidence was clear. The broken bones, the beatings, the calculated arson. It was not a moment of rage. It was cold, deliberate murder. The defense's arguments were weak and full of holes, and they did little to sway the jury. The closing statements were a turning point. Claire Mitchell stood before the jury, her voice steady and resolute as she addressed them directly. James Turner is not the man you think he is, she began. He used his position of power to control, manipulate, and ultimately destroy the life of the woman who trusted him. He beat her, he trapped her, and when she threatened to leave, he killed her. He did not act in a moment of madness, he acted in cold blood. This trial is about more than just a man and his wife. It is about the truth coming to light, and room fell silent as the jury filed out to deliberate. Harris sat in his seat, his eyes fixed on the empty chairs where Turner had once sat. He had done all he could, and now it was out of his hands. The verdict came the next afternoon. Guilty of first-degree murder, the foreman announced. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and disbelief. Pastor James Turner, the man who had once stood at the pulpit, preaching about forgiveness and redemption, was now a convicted murderer. His reign over the town, built on lies and fear, was over. Harris watched as Turner was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of defiance. But Harris knew the truth. Turner could run from his past, but he could never escape it. As Harris left the courthouse, the weight of the case finally lifted from his shoulders. It had been a long, hard journey, one that had taken him deep into the darkness of a man's soul. But in the end, justice had been served. Deborah Turner had not died in vain. The truth had come to light, and the man who had destroyed her life would now pay the price for his actions. Harris knew that the town of Vicksburg would never be the same. The people would have to rebuild their trust, their faith, and their sense of community. But for now, justice had prevailed, and that was all that mattered.